Gentlemen, welcome to a joint meeting of the Homelessness and Poverty Committee and our Health and Mental Health Committee. I'm joined by David Rue, the chair of the Health and Mental Health Committee. My name is Marquise Harris-Dawson. I'm the chair of the Homelessness and Poverty Committee. We've joined by our colleagues, council members Karen Price, Mitchell Englander, Mike Bonin, Gil Cedillo. I will turn the microphone over to the chair of our Health and Mental Health Committee to introduce a special presentation. But before that, we have a couple of speakers who signed up to speak on almost every item. And so the rule in this committee is that you get 2 minutes to speak on items, specific items that are on the agenda, and a minute of public comment. So I have one speaker named Herman and another one named Wayne. You will have 3 minutes each, 2 on an agenda item, 1 on general public comment.
Got it, bro. I'm on. Set the time. You know, time is...
Your time is going, Mr. Herman.
That's the best thing about time. It's irrelevant. But thank you for being here, Mr. Zev Zarowski, and anyone else who's involved in the UCLA shenanigans, you know. Those of us who have been homeless since 2008, those of us who are continuing to be participants of the increasing homelessness, is just a bad example of poor failure by the city of Los Angeles to spend the fucking money on people who need the help. We're spending money on a fucking alley river, to build a Ferris wheel, to build a fucking big white bridge to connect my old home of Boyle Heights to the white side of Mr. Bonin of transportation. Yeah, motherfucker, I came by the train. That's the reason why you kicked me out of that meeting upstairs earlier. Because I came by a fucking train and I walked over here. Because I'm here to bitch on Measure H. Homeless service agencies on the County of Los Angeles, Measure H. And on behalf of all the schizophrenic, bipolar motherfuckers in this world, fuck you, Bonin. And then I go into the next item, homelessness strategy, committee, report, comprehensive homeless strategy. What the fuck you waiting for? What strategy? Get on the fucking game and play ball, rookies. You don't go start a basketball team without players. You build the team with players and you play the fucking game. Hoop for hoop, defense and offense, rebound and slam dunk. But so far, you admitted that you allowed the increase of homelessness, right, Rue? You were there at the county board yesterday with me. Woo-hoo. So that's how fucked up all this is. I have to represent the homeless population by using intensifiers to express how fucked up Measure H, Dibble Dwarf, and Measure H is misrepresented by all the UCLA fucking assholes that don't come in here and support and advocate on behalf of homelessness. Now, if you take those fucking graduates and give them a job, then they can place us in homes, give us medical help, give us services under Title II of the ADA, but instead you violate our rights under affordable housing, and that's the reason why we're homeless. Fuck you.
Mr. Spindler?
Various puppets here today, and as you can see over here to my left, we have the 5th place finisher failure for the Board of Supervisors. We have the bigamist over there, and then of course we have Mike Bonin, the Brown Act violator of 2017, the terrorist. So we tried to talk with our friends about homelessness and transportation and all of these good shit. And what do we get? We look at this white fucking head bobbing up and down going, yes, I violated the Brown Act again. And then we got Rue, who tries to keep himself clean because he wants to avoid being indicted. And then we have all of these garbage on the agenda. See, what happened is that the city of Los Angeles got sued for violation of civil rights under the Bain Act and 42 U.S.C. 1983. They got a restraining order because the city attorney said Herb Wesson is employed by the office of the city attorney, got a restraining order, and now they're filing a criminal complaint. Yes, they're filing criminal charges to gain an advantage in a civil case. Now we have ADA and rehabilitation. The Trump administration is going to sue you for $939 million to fix all of your federal funded housing. You know what happens, Zeb? They pocketed the money. So all these buildings went up. They got money for ADA compliance. They didn't bother to spend the fucking money on it. And now Trump is going to sue them. Yes. Yes, they had made a motion here a couple of weeks ago that they think Donald Trump should be impeached. The only people that are going to be impeached are you scumbags. You're not going to go anywhere with Donald Trump. He's the POTUS. POTUS is Latin for fuck you. Look it up on Google. Yes, the POTUS is fucking tired of all of these stupid shit. So, please, Zeb, resign. Stay away from these criminals, because you had a distinguished career. Yes, the city is going to hell. It's going bankrupt. It's really a piece of shit. But on a good note, and I'm glad to see Mr. Cedillo is feeling better, and that's good.
That concludes our public comment section. For those of you who are new, you will recognize that we're required to allow a broad range of speech that is interpreted as political speech, even speech that we consider hate speech is often inside the scope of what the courts view as political speech. And so with that, the closure of our public comment time, I'll turn it over to the chair of our Health and Mental Health Committee, Councilmember David Rue.
Thank you, Councilmember Marquise Harris-Dawson. It is a pleasure to have a joint committee meeting here with you today, and we are very excited to have former council member and Supervisor Zev Yoslavsky and his team from the Los Angeles Institute and FM3 Research. They presented to my committee last year for the first year study that they did on the LA County Quality of Life Index. But because so much of the report dealt with poverty and homelessness, I wanted to provide their team an opportunity to inform both of our committees. And I also just want to quickly plug the LA Institute, which is at my alma mater, UCLA. The Institute focuses on policy, politics, and the history of Los Angeles region. And it's always important and appreciated when our local institutions spend some of their research time looking at home and not always abroad. With that said, I just want to hand it off to Supervisor Yaroslavsky.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Harris-Dawson, and the other members of the two committees. I'm going to be very brief and then turn it over so we can get right into the study. The Los Angeles Initiative at UCLA conducts a survey once a year that asks county residents to rate their own quality of life in 9 different categories. They rate them on a scale of 10 to 100, and you will see some of those results today. And we've asked our public research experts to break it out for the city of Los Angeles, so you get to take a look at the city versus the rest of the county and how the ratings stack up between the two. And we also ask a series of questions that are unrelated to the index, but are just standalone questions of compelling issues of the day. Homelessness was one of them. This year, 2 important questions that were asked, and I think you will find them interesting and relevant to the work you're doing here in your committees and in the City Council, and that is gentrification and the immigration deportation issues and how that's impacting residents of this county. As last year, some of the findings were quite stunning and staggering and lend themselves to a revisitation of the intensity with which we have to deal with some of those issues, particularly the fear and anxiety over deportation in the county of Los Angeles and in the city of Los Angeles, which is the ground zero for the immigration issues of our nation. So with that, let me first of all introduce and acknowledge my partner at UCLA, my former Chief of Staff, Elisa Belenkoff-Katz, and the two of us, in addition to Adam Sonnenschein, will be happy to answer questions when Adam completes his presentation. Let me turn it over to Adam Sonnenschein, who quarterbacked the survey for us.
Thank you, Supervisor, and thank you to the chairs of the two committees and members as well. We're going to go through the findings of the survey and also have time for some questions at the end as well. Just to give you a sense of the methodology of this survey, it's a little bit different than some of the election surveys and ballot measure types of surveys that come before you pretty regularly. In this case, we did nearly 1,600 interviews, as the supervisor said, throughout the county. We added an additional 150 interviews with residents, Asian Pacific Islander residents, on a couple of the issues we thought would be most relevant to try to reflect some of the diversity within that community. Overall, the margin of error on the survey is plus or minus 2.5%. This survey was done with a mix of online interviews, phone interviews, cell phones, landlines, with a random digit dial. So these are not only registered voters, these are all residents of the County of Los Angeles. And the interviews were available in English and Spanish. And then we took the responses and made sure that they reflected the demographic categories in the county. Let's see if we can move forward. There we go. So the sort of heart of the survey is the index, as the supervisor mentioned, where we tried to take a bunch of ratings of a lot of different issues and synthesize them into a single number. We asked the survey respondents to rate their satisfaction with 40 different aspects of quality of life, and we combined those into 9 categories. They rated the items individually. They rated the importance of the items against each other within a category. They rated the categories against each other, and we weighted that level of importance of these different items with the satisfaction to generate an overall singular number. And so as we take you through the results, focusing first on the index, in this case, the index number came out to 59, and as the supervisor mentioned, this was on a 10 to 100 scale as people rated things from 1 to 10 or 10 to 100. It's actually the same number as last year. So some of the items went up, some of the items went down. They actually balanced in the same point. We broke the categories down, those 9 categories we discussed, into 3 tiers: negative, neutral, and positive. On the left-hand side of the slide here, the negative categories, those rated kind of the lower tier, were transportation and traffic, which saw a reduction from 2016 in satisfaction, education, which saw a small reduction in satisfaction, and cost of living. On the right-hand side, areas that were the highest rated in our survey were relations between people of different races, ethnicities, and religion, ratings of one's own neighborhood and healthcare, and then the middle tier here was the environment, public safety, and jobs in the economy. On that overall number, the 59 score, I'm going to take you through a couple of the demographic differences so you can see how people's overall scores varied. In the city of LA, the number was a little bit lower than the other areas of the county, the non-city communities, be they other cities or other unincorporated areas. I should say, as this was done with random digit dial and we don't have people's particular addresses, there's a bit of fuzziness because we're going by zip code, and some zip codes overlap the city and other communities as well, but fairly close from one to the other. Where we saw the biggest gap this year, and will be reflected in a number of different findings throughout the survey, is by age. Young people were the least satisfied and older people were more satisfied, and you see a direct progression as we step up from the left-hand side. 18 to 29-year-olds, their satisfaction score was a 53. 30 to 39-year-olds, a 55. All the way up to 75-plus age group, their score was a 67. We'll get into some of the categories so you can see why we had that type of difference. By race and ethnicity, not nearly as stark a difference, but we find Asians and whites a little bit on the higher end, Latinos and African Americans a little bit on the lower end. As the supervisor mentioned, we had a number of questions that were not used to calculate the index. They weren't ratings of satisfaction, but they were very interesting questions that we think are informative in a number of ways. The first questions we're going to look at in that regard are related to deportation and immigration. And we asked everybody, are you worried that you, a friend of yours, or a member of your family will be deported from the United States because of their immigration status? And we wanted to take it out of just asking about themselves, as that's a fairly awkward question to ask people to answer in a phone survey, but making it a little bit broader, their friend or a member of their family. And we found over a third of residents of the county say they were worried about that happening. 19% say they were very worried. 18% say they were a little worried. Where that has policy implications, actually, I'm sorry, let me take you one quick breakdown here demographically. Not terribly surprisingly, Latinos were the strongest in their concern. 56% of Latinos said they were either very or a little worried that they themselves, a family member or a friend, could be deported. But you see African Americans, whites, nearly at 20%, and Asians at 31%. And as I was saying, where this plays into policy implications that you may want to consider, that 37%, we followed up with them and said, are you worried that you're at a greater risk of deportation by enrolling in a government health care, education, or housing program? And we found that 80% of the people who were concerned about deportation said they were more concerned that that would happen if they enrolled in some sort of government assistance program of those three kinds. And we've seen numerous anecdotal stories in the news recently that confirm that, and we think is fairly concerning. Okay, the next issue that we looked at was neighborhood gentrification, and we had a number of questions about this, but just highlighting this one in particular. We asked a number of things that could be happening in one's own community and asked if the impact of those changes had been positive or negative on their community. In this case, that what you're seeing is the data on replacement of community residents by those who are willing to pay more for housing. Within the city of Los Angeles, 17% of respondents said that had a positive impact on their community. 61% said negative, slightly more muted, but still leaning heavily to the negative side for the other areas of LA County outside of the city, where 21% say that had a positive impact and 50% say negative. Now, there's another aspect to this gentrification issue, and that's looking at growth and development. In this question, we provided a bit of a pro and con statement where we gave people some of the reasons they may think that new building development and growth in their communities had a negative impact, also some reasons why they may think it had a positive impact, and asked them which one came closer to their opinion. And we found a closer question than the previous one, but still a little bit leaning to the negative when they think about the increases in traffic and building sizes and small businesses. Okay, one of the things I know you've all dealt with as a councilman is the cost of housing. And in this question, we asked if respondents had experienced a close friend or family member considering moving from their neighborhood in the last few years because of rising housing costs. And over half of the respondents in the city of LA say they have had that experience within the last few years, a little bit higher even than residents in other communities.
If I can just interject for 1 second on that issue of the housing, because I don't know whether we're going to get to that. Cost of living was the lowest rated category of the 9 categories in our survey, and close to half of the people who rated cost of living said that the biggest factor in their rating of cost of living was the cost of housing. It's clearly the number one issue driving that rating, and it is a significant issue. This is not news to anybody around this table, but it's validation for what you already know. In terms of the geography, which I'm not sure we have the map of this here, but I think it's important for members of the LA City Council to know that the ground zero for this, the numbers are very negative on all of these gentrification and housing issues in the central part of the city, which many of you represent. Again, I don't think I'm telling you anything you don't know, but you have some data now that validates what you see day in and day out crossing your desks.
One of the other types of individual questions that we looked at was concerns about hunger and homelessness within people's daily lives. We asked if people in the last few years had worried about themselves or their family going hungry, primarily because they could not afford the cost of food. We found that the concern is pretty high. 21% in this year's survey said that they had that concern. It's a little bit less than the previous year. It's hard to try to explain why certain findings are the way they are, although we have seen somewhat of an uptick in the local economy, and some of it may be just some statistical variance from one year to the other. But still, even at 21%, we think quite a striking figure there. And then on the next slide, concern about losing your home and becoming homeless. In 2017, 23% of our respondents said that that was a concern that they had within the last few years. And this question, this is about themselves, not about friends and family in that sort of extension, just looking at themselves. Okay. We did the survey in late February and early March, and at that time there was a lot of discussion, as there continues to be now, about repeal and replace of the Affordable Care Act. At that time there was no particular plan on the table. It was just talk that something like that would happen. And so we asked people if they thought that the repeal of the Affordable Care Act and replacing it with a new federal health care law would improve their access to quality medical care, would make it worse, or would not make a difference. And without knowing the specifics of such a plan, 14% of respondents said it would make their access to health care better, but 48% said it would make it worse, including a third that said much worse. On the next slide, you see the differences by insurance type, and now this is self-reported data in terms of one's insurance status, so there may be some confusion in terms of the type of coverage that people have, but what you see is people with Medi-Cal or an Affordable Care Act insurance policy are the most likely to say that these types of changes would have a negative impact on them. The only people who are close to kind of a neutral standpoint are those who have a private insurance plan that they pay for themselves. Those on Medicare, Medi-Cal, Covered California are all strongly feeling like that type of change would have a negative impact on their access to quality health care. So those were standalone questions. These are some of the individual ones, and I'm going to try to move quickly. I know that there's other things to talk about and questions to be answered. The data that's in here is primarily LA County data from the full sample of the survey. I did want to mention, when we look at the LA City specific numbers, they tend to be a bit lower than residents in other areas of the county. As you saw, we have the overall index a little bit lower. Where we had the largest differences were in assessments of neighborhood condition and quality, things like street repair, street condition, and economic opportunity, the ability for someone to get ahead financially or get a good paying job. By contrast, there were some areas where LA City residents were more satisfied than residents of other areas of the county, and in particular that's with the impact of immigrants in their community, as well as the steps that have been taken to deal with the drought. So taking you through a couple of the index categories, these were those first items, the lower rated items here: transportation and traffic, education, and cost of living. I'm just going to explain the format of these slides because they're a little bit complicated. On the left-hand side, you see the numbers that we asked, that people gave in terms of their satisfaction score, that 10 to 100 score. How satisfied were you? The dark blue is the score from this year. The light blue is the score from last year's survey, so you can see the change in the single year. On the right-hand side, when we ask people to rate the importance of those items against each other, you see those scores. Again, the dark blue is this year's survey, and the light blue is last year's. And in this case, what we see is the condition of streets and roads is the area where, within transportation and traffic, that people have the least amount of satisfaction, and actually one of the bigger decreases from the previous year. And as I mentioned, an area that LA City residents are even strongly more concerned, as well as that being the most important item within the transportation and traffic category. In terms of education, the areas where people are most satisfied is access to higher education, whether that's community colleges, four-year universities in the city and the county. But there's more concern about the level of funding and the training children and young adults receive for the jobs of the future. The quality of education overall seems to be the more important item. As I mentioned, when we looked at the overall demographics, younger people were less satisfied than older people overall, and that carries through pretty strikingly on education, where residents who were 18 to 39 years old were the least satisfied across all elements of the education categories, which is fairly striking, as they're the ones either most recently involved or probably most currently involved in that education system. Cost of living, as the supervisor mentioned, if you look down near the bottom, what you pay for housing, mortgages, and rents, it's one of the lowest scores in terms of satisfaction in the survey at 47, decreasing from the previous year and increasing in importance. Now it's 48% of respondents calling that the most important issue within this category of cost of living, and something that I know that the council is working to address. When you look at the age breakdown, again, you see this striking number where the youngest people are the least satisfied with the cost of housing, mortgages, or rents. The oldest people are clearly the most satisfied, those who probably have been more established in their own home. Okay, some of the more positive findings and things I think we can feel good about. These items include the relations between people of different races, ethnicities, and religions, one's neighborhood, and healthcare. So if you look at those community relation scores, we see the number one item here, the most satisfied, being your relations with different ethnic and racial groups in Los Angeles County. And I do want to emphasize that for all of these questions, we've tried to make them about one's own experiences, not their rating of what they think other people have dealt with, not how they think race relations are, generally speaking, in the country or even in LA County, but one's own relations with different ethnic and racial groups in Los Angeles County. And we see fairly high numbers compared to some of the other factors that we saw earlier in the survey. And here we see that same question broken out by racial and ethnic groups, and we see high numbers across the board from Latinos, whites, Asians, and African Americans. In neighborhood quality, there's some good news and some more mixed stories as well. The availability of fresh, nutritious groceries near your home, people tend to rate at a high level of satisfaction, as well as the availability of parks and overall condition and quality of your neighborhood, although I will mention this is one of the areas in which LA City residents have lower ratings than residents outside the city. And then one where the movement is more to the negative is the rate of growth and development near your home, which mirrors some of the findings we saw earlier. In terms of healthcare, broadly speaking, fairly positive opinions about one's access to medical care, the quality of care that they receive, and their ability to choose doctors. And still positive, but less so when you look at the last category on the list, which is the amount you pay for the health care you and your immediate family receive. And we saw earlier people would not be in favor of changing, the healthcare law in the way that it seemed to be discussed at that time. This sort of underpins that they're broadly satisfied with their access as it stands now. And then some of the neutral categories, the environment, public safety, jobs, and the economy. If you look at public safety first, fairly consistent ratings on all 4 of these items and consistent from the previous year. Safety from terrorism or mass shootings, safety from violent crime, property crimes, these are a very, very slight reduction from 64 to 62, and people rating their safety from violent crime as the most important factor for them. In terms of the environment, the broad category we have here of the Southern California environment, mountains, beaches, deserts, and weather, continues to be something that people are happy with. People like the weather in LA. I guess that's not a terribly new story to be told. The next step, though, the steps being taken to deal with the drought, you see a fairly big increase from last year to this year. Of course, this survey being done after a pretty rainy season of the winter there. Quality of water, quality of air, fairly consistent from the previous year. And then jobs and the economy, lastly. The first 2 questions here were asked of people who reported that they had a job. They're fairly satisfied with their prospect of keeping their job or with their job. If you flip down to the bottom and look at that last item, your prospects for getting a good job, that was asked of people that said they don't have a job now and they're looking for one. There you see a bump up from the previous year, but still a fair amount of concern there as people see an increase in employment, but also if you're out looking for a job, you still are in need of some help. So those are our highlighted survey results. I don't know if you have any other comments.
Yeah, I'll just make a couple closing comments to our presentation, Mr. Chairman. Just another note on the issue of gentrification. On the negative rating given in the was 48% on those. I believe that the same question, right, on these. And in the central part of Los Angeles, the negative rating given was 68%. So we're talking about Boyle Heights, Pico Union, Echo Park, downtown, the area, City Hall adjacent and its surroundings, very impactful. Younger people feel particularly impacted by it. I want to just emphasize one more time about the immigration deportation. That figure really is startling in its numbers. And just to put it in stark numbers, 38%, 37% of the sample said they were either very worried or worried. Half of them, or 19% of the entire sample, said they were very worried. That's 1.9 million people in this county who feel they or a member of their family or a friend has a bullseye on their back. And it has a profound impact, as Adam mentioned, in terms of the reticence of people to engage government, not just on health, housing, and those issues, but as Chief Beck announced a couple of months ago, that the number of people reporting domestic violence crimes in immigrant communities had plummeted. And I've heard anecdotally in the county that some of the human service departments have also seen a drop in people engaging them. So it has an impact. It's not just a statistic. It has a consequence. So I wanted to just point that out. 68%, as opposed to 47% countywide, 68% central Los Angeles. And the other thing which we talked about when the results came in is the young people. Young people have always been the more optimistic, had a whole life to look forward to. They had hope, they had optimism, they could conquer the world. But in this survey, we see that young people are the most dissatisfied, and it's primarily in the economic issues on which they're dissatisfied. The housing, the ability to get a job, the health care, all of the things that they should not have to be worrying about at this point. There is security and retirement, which was a question we asked in the index. The people who are most least satisfied about their prospects in terms of retirement security were people who were between 18 and 29 years old. And in a real sense, if you want to know who's satisfied and who isn't satisfied, I can tell you that if you're between 18 and 29, if you commute more than an hour, you're probably not a satisfied person in this county these days. Don't know what you do about that in the short run, but it's all part of the larger mosaic and the machinery of what's going on in our economy. So with that, we're happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you, Supervisor, and thank you for the great presentation. I just had a couple of quick questions. So, talking about the younger folks, what your survey shows is also myself and Marquise Harris Dawson, Councilmember Harris Dawson, we did a panel discussion at LMU, and they did a very not as extensive survey, and they also showed that it was the young folks as well who thought there's a more higher likelihood of another riots happening. This was in April for the 25th anniversary of the LA riots. So, and you kind of alluded to it, but I don't think, is it just the traffic why the survey is showing that the younger groups are less satisfied than the older cohorts, or do you have any other insights that?
Well, you can answer the traffic question. I think the traffic question relates to where the longer the commute, the farther away you live from your job. That doesn't mean that you live in San Bernardino County and you're working in LA. We wouldn't have surveyed anybody in San Bernardino County. It means you may live in Koreatown and work in Chatsworth, or work in West LA or Santa Monica. These are all county residents who are saying my commute is more than an hour. And it's the young people who are most likely to live the farthest away from work because the housing is less expensive the farther away you get from the employment centers. So it all fits in. On the Loyola survey, I'm aware of the question that was asked. Is another civil disturbance possible? I suppose if you asked me if one is possible, I would have said yes, anything is possible. The question that wasn't asked was how likely do you think it is? The other thing that the Loyola survey asked was the same kinds of questions we asked here about how people rate race relations, how comfortable they think they are, and their results mirrored exactly the same as we did. I don't think there's any question and one can speculate what the reasons are. This is a different city and county than it was 25 years ago in terms of race relations. We work with people who are different than us. We go to school with people who are different than us. We get married. We date people who are different than us far more than we did 25 years ago. If I could just use the one example, we interviewed a lot of people, a number of people, not a lot, but a number of the people who were among our respondents just to find out, just to drill down a little more. And on the deportation issue, there was a 57-year-old Anglo woman in Manhattan Beach who was asked and she said she was worried about her friends being deported from, well, she was worried about either her or her friends or her family being deported from the United States. And so we asked her why. Why are you worried? And she said, well, my kids go to school with immigrants. They work in my community. They live in my community. I don't want to see them deported. That would be a terrible thing to do. Now, I guarantee you, and you worked in the county some years ago, 25 years ago, that a 57-year-old Anglo woman in Manhattan Beach would not have had that response. This city and the county has matured. I think that doesn't mean that we are a perfect society. Far from it. But we have to recognize the progress that's been made. Some of it through the efforts of people like yourselves, and some of it through the natural order of things. And this is a much more interconnected society than it was 25 years ago, and certainly more than it was 40, 45 years ago. And that's reflected in these numbers, and it was reflected in the questions that we followed up with the respondents. I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
Only on the young people and their satisfaction. I think it really is, as the supervisor said, economic opportunity and education is where the cost of housing, the ability to get a job, the amount of funding they see going into K-12 schools, the quality of the schools, the quality of the amount that they pay for health care, broadly across all of these categories, we just see younger people being less satisfied than those who are older.
I'm going to let my colleagues ask questions, but I just have one more question. I noticed that homelessness, the fear of becoming homeless, improved from last year. But not only did it improve, but also, I remember last year, one of the stark questions or statistics was that people in the higher income levels were afraid of becoming homeless. So we've seen it seems like there's been improvement in both of those.
The improvement has been primarily in that second category that you mentioned, where we do see a decrease in the overall number of people who say they were worried about becoming homeless. That was most stark in the people who were middle to upper income. $90,000 to $120,000 income level, and it is hard to sort of give you a why specifically. I think there's a couple of reasons, though. One is that there's been a lot of effort and a lot of discussion and public debate about the city and the county taking steps to address homelessness, and a lot more discussion of the services that are available. And it's possible, although this is speculative, that people at that income bracket are sort of seeing what has been going on. The other possibility is that the way the question's asked is that it's over within the past several years. Have you felt that? And there could be that those were people last year who felt it more coming out of the economic, the housing crisis of a few years ago. And now as each year comes on, those more middle and upper income people are less likely to say that. That's something we'll have to track in the next year's survey as well.
But how do you juxtapose?
If I could just add, having said all of that, almost 1 in 4 people in the county are worried about becoming homeless. If we had given you that figure a year ago, you would have said that's big.
Right.
So
it was almost a 1 in 3 last year.
Yeah.
So it
It's
improved.
1 in 3.
But then the actual question I want to ask was about how do you juxtapose that with those concerns got lowered, but housing cost concerns increased. So I guess they're seeing all these things happening, or they're hearing about it. So is that why?
Yeah, like I said, it's a hard question to answer that in terms of why. I think that the concern about housing costs continue to go up. That's undoubtedly true. Although it seems like the people who are bearing the brunt of that are more younger people, and they may be less likely to be feeling like they're at risk of homelessness. Maybe they feel like they have some other connections. It's pretty hard to try to unpack all of that.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wu. I believe there's some other members with questions. Mr. Cedillo?
I'm impressed as I was just in a recent re-election campaign, and I'm impressed by the concern that all Angelenos have towards immigrants in our society, that they are pretty much accepted as being woven into the social fabric, and I think your survey confirms that. Having said that, though, Supervisor, you've got an incredible life experience in public service. We have a conflict. The city and the state are at odds with the administration in Washington. We have a conflict with our police department, which has a long history of not getting engaged in activities of ICE and the old INS. And we have ICE taking the name of our police department and calling themselves police and going to people's homes, courthouses, outside school, and seizing people. As a experienced government leader, what suggestions do you have for us to create a separation between the current administration and the conduct of ICE and our city and our county?
Well, it's a good question, Councilman. And first, I want to compliment the city, Mayor Garcetti, and the City Council for the efforts you've made to try to draw a demarcation line between municipal law enforcement and what the federal immigration authorities are doing. But it's tough because, one tweet by the President of the United States can overwhelm, 6 months of work by your city government, basically because it sows fear. And you know, I've represented immigrants from my own my parents' ancestral homeland and elsewhere. Nothing moves so fast as a rumor about some immigration enforcement action and what the implications could be for an immigrant. I saw it when 20 years ago when they were talking about taking immigrants off of SSI. I've seen it as you have over the years. So I think you've got to keep doing and ratchet up the public relations aspect of informing the communities that are targeted, the immigrant communities, and make it abundantly clear that your police department, your health department, you don't have one but the county does, welfare department, the food security agencies, the nonprofits are not cooperating in the deportation of people who are not documented but who are otherwise law-abiding citizens. And just keep pounding that away, because I think what this is telling you is that there is a high level of anxiety. And it's not just among immigrants, it's among people who know immigrants. Another anecdotal example in one of our interviews, there was a man in his 20s, early 30s in the San Gabriel Valley, half Latino, half Anglo, had a Latina girlfriend. Her mother is undocumented, and he's worried. He's worried that his mother-in-law-to-be is going to be deported. And I don't know whether he's worried that he's not going to have a mother-in-law, or he's worried that his girlfriend's going to go with her mother-in-law, or whether it's going to affect their relationship. But he's worried, and he's very worried. And so this level of anxiety has to be counteracted, and it's tough because you're up against a guy who can tweet and drown you out.
Right.
But people are listening in this community, and they're listening in the Spanish language and Asian Pacific Islander language. I'll tell you that when this survey came out, the Spanish language television stations and the Korean and the Chinese ran stories on this that ran 3.5 minutes.
Yeah.
When was the last time you saw a news story on television that ran 3.5 minutes? This is a big deal to them. So I would say, you guys run public relations public information campaigns all the time. The county has spent a fortune on public information campaigns. Metro has spent a fortune running public information campaigns. Run a public information campaign on what you're doing and what you won't do, and let that sink in over time. I think it's important to mitigate this high level of anxiety, and it's not good for anybody. If somebody I work with in the workplace is not going to the doctor because for some reason, or not going to the health clinic because he's afraid the health clinic is going to turn him over to ICE, that doesn't do me any good, even though I don't have to be worried about it, right? So I think there's a ratchet up role to play.
Excellent. If there are no other questions from members,
I got a whole slew. One of the challenges for us as we try to address this question of building the amount of housing we need. We need 100,000 units of housing. We need 32,000 units of affordable low-income housing. Is the resistance, and it came out in your survey, that people see development as something that's bad. How do you suggest we address this type of NIMBYism that exists? We've got interim control ordinances. As you know, the city will utilize those at times to stop development. How do you think we address that within the context of the city of Los Angeles?
Well, this is a totally different subject, mostly different. But if you want my opinion, I'll give you my opinion, since I've sat in this horseshoe for 20 years. First of all, I think it's absurd to think that it's just zoning issues or community planning issues or NIMBYism that has affected the supply of housing. First and foremost, it's the economy. It's lending policies. It's whether you can get financing. there's a lot of residential development taking place in this town right now. Just not affordable. It's market rate, and I think the city bears some responsibility in that. I don't think the city has been willing to go the extra mile in trying to require and extort, in the legal sense of the word, concessions from developers who you're giving huge development. You give them density bonuses and height exemptions and all this. Get something in exchange for it. Just don't give it away. And what you get in exchange for it is not 10% or 15% affordable housing, but 40% or 50% affordable housing. Inclusionary zoning. That's number one. Number two, one man's NIMBY is another man's lifetime investment. And why is a homeowner who is about to have his property or her property value eviscerated by a skyscraper next to their home in NIMBY, and the developer who got a zone change from the city of Los Angeles not a NIMBY? There are places in this town, and plenty of them. I told your planning director a few months ago, Vince Bertoni, I said, you and I get in the car, for 2 days we'll drive around Los Angeles, and I guarantee you that we'll find ample places where you could legitimately, without a political controversy, and legitimately increase density. But there will be places where it's inappropriate. It's inappropriate to increase density adjacent to an historic preservation overlay zone. How would you like 7-story buildings all around Angelino Heights? What would that do to Angelino Heights? Kind of defeats the purpose of the historical preservation zone, doesn't it? Same thing with the South Carthay HPOZ or the Rancho La Brea HPOZ. There are places where it's appropriate, and there are places where it isn't. It can't be a one-size-fits-all. And I hope, and I gather that from the comments that were made after the Measure S campaign, that nobody took got the wrong lesson from it. The measure was flawed. There was a massive campaign to defeat it, and people bought that story. But I got a call from a reporter shortly afterwards who said, in your old council district, the 5th District, which in my day was the most impacted, outside of downtown, the most impacted development area in the city, he says, it lost by 69-31 or something like that citywide. It lost by over close to 74% in the 5th District. Is that a mandate for more development? And I said, I guarantee you one thing I know a lot of things I don't know, but one thing I know, that the people in Paul Koretz's district did not vote down Measure S because they want more shopping centers, more high-rises, and more gridlock. They bought the line that it was going to affect housing in a generic sense, but they don't want the exemptions and the spot zoning and all that's characterized development in the city long before you guys got here. So, I don't know how much has been done since November when Measure S was on the ballot to accelerate the updates of the community plans and how that process is taking place. But you can address the issue of supply to the extent that you can influence it. You can address it through zone changes in the appropriate places. But it can't be one broad brush that every neighborhood in the city, every strip commercial street in the city should have its density doubled or tripled or quadrupled. Not right. And if you took me for a ride in your district, you would tell me where it's appropriate and where it isn't appropriate. There's a building in Chinatown that was built next to the Chinatown light rail station, the Blue Line, that is god-awful. And I don't know how the people of the Chinatown community let that happen, because you could have built a great housing project, transit-oriented development that reflected the Chinatown architecture and the historic nature of the place. I think this predates you I don't even know if you represent Chinatown, but it's just, I wouldn't want it in Century City, let alone in an area that has such historic richness. So those are the kinds of things which it's hard to take each community plan and dissect it and see what's appropriate, because you gotta engage people, you gotta engage stakeholders, you're gonna step on some toes one way or the other, but you gotta do it. That's how these plans got developed in the first place. There are plans all over the city that are being abrogated one property at a time. Those plans were developed by stakeholders, developers, property owners, homeowners, chambers of commerce, and maybe some of them are outdated. Without a doubt, some of them are outdated. So update them in a systematic way. It's not going to be easy, but it's got to be done. I think the people, that was a warning shot to the city. That Measure S was a warning shot. And no one should take from that result that people have mandated that density uber alles. Not the case. People do not, and I think that's reflected here. What's interesting, Councilman Cedillo, is that it's in the central part of the city, which historically has been pro-development. Of course, they never had a whole lot of development. Now they're getting a lot of development in this location. It's the central part of the city, and in many cases the poorest parts of the city, that are more anti-development than anywhere else in the city. And it's kind of an opposite of what it was 30 years ago. But basically, there's a way to do this right and treat the citizenry with respect, give them a voice. My experience is 85% of the time you can satisfy 85% of the concerns of people. And if you can do that, you're ahead of the game. Ty Cobb only batted 400 and he's in the Hall of Fame. If you can bat 850, you're doing real well.
Got a question from Mr. Englander.
Thank you.
Quick, two easy questions as it pertains to the methodology on the poll. But first, I wanted to thank you because this is not only enlightening, it's great to get some perspective from a poll and survey, but more importantly, the input back in the conversation and dialogue, because that's only a piece of paper, although I've been reading polls for 30 years. So one of the two questions I've got, one is, would you be making the crosstabs, because I think as important as a poll and the conversation about a poll are doing a deeper dive into the crosstabs and looking at some of the analysis of, particularly in the subregions and some of those key issues. Would you be making those available either online or to our offices if possible?
It's not up now, is it?
It's not available right now, but it will be shortly on the UCLA website.
Great. And then
UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs website.
right, sure, okay.
So that would be there's a
Although
more,
maybe you should
a more
probably go on
detailed
through
PowerPoint.
I'm sorry?
There's a more detailed PowerPoint than this even that will be up as well as the top line and crosstabs from the poll.
Okay, yeah. Look at the crosstabs would be
We can get them.
very interesting. And then be very interested in seeing those. And maybe it should go on the medical website too, so we can dissect it. And then on the subregions, did you ask by any chance? Did you break those out and ask specifically with community identification, or was it just as a resident of LA County?
We asked if people lived in LA County and then what zip code they live in. So we were able to cross-check that against zip code files.
I don't mean for the crosstab purposes, but the purposes of their particular answer. For example, there are many places throughout the county that simply don't identify with the word Los Angeles at all. And the second you bring that up, you're automatically 10 points behind whatever question you're going to ask on quality of life or any concern or issue affecting them. That's my experience anyway. When you ask somebody, for example, in my district or in the San Fernando Valley, do you like the quality of life, or what is your, and you start getting into the details of, or the San Gabriel Valley, or people, you localize it more. And I just was curious when you went into the subregions if any of those questions were specific to that subregion rather than just the county as a whole.
No, in fact, it's probably not even to the county, it's to themselves. So we asked about their own experiences, regardless of kind of the region of the county that they live in.
Great, good to know. Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Mr. Price, you're good? All right. With that, we will thank the folks from the Luskin School, especially our City Council alumni, Supervisor Xavier Slosky. We thank you so much for your contribution, to your continued contribution to the city on these very, very important issues. Mr. Chairman?
Thank you so very Yes, thank you so very much to the UCLA School of Luskin, Supervisor Xavier Slosky, Lisa Katz, and Adam Sonnenschein. Thank you so much for that lengthy study. And we could get a copy of that, right? The full with the crosstabs?
Yep.
Yeah, great. And I think this is where we part ways.
That's right.
But the meeting of Health, Mental Health, and Education Committee will continue in room 1060 on the 10th floor. We have several agenda items, so if anyone is here to speak on any of the items for Health, Mental Health, and Education Committee, please join us in room 1060.
Excellent. And the Homelessness and Poverty Committee will continue here at this moment. So, Mr. Clerk, if you could read our first item into the record.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. Item number 2 is the verbal status update by the CAO, Housing and Community Department, and Los Angeles Homeless Service Agency on the County of Los Angeles Measure H.
Excellent. So, we have presentation on this matter. We have no cards, so the floor is all yours. Welcome.
Good afternoon, council members. I'm Rushmore Cervantes, General Manager of the Housing and Community Investment Department.
Peter Lynn, Executive Director for the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority.
Meg Barclay, City Homeless Coordinator in the CAO's office.
I'll go first. Richard Llewellyn, the CAO, and myself were designated as the 2 city participants in the 52-member committee to work with the County of Los Angeles to identify funding levels for 21 homeless strategy initiatives. 17 were originally part of the county's homeless strategy. The additional 4 strategies were part of Measure H. So over the course of about a month and a half, 5 meetings with 52 people, with over 240 public comments from organizations and individuals, we were able to finally discern a budget that we could all agree upon. And I think it's important to note that our job as members of that committee was not to design the programs, but merely to take into consideration the various proposals from the county departments and, if you will, negotiate with our partners and come up with recommendations as to how best to proceed for the first 3 years. It is estimated that this Measure H quarter-cent sales tax will yield approximately $355 million a year. It looks like this first year, it's anticipated that we will receive roughly $258 million. The Board of Equalization has notified the county that the tax will go into effect on October 1st. I will say that it was nice to be part of a planning group in which the City of Los Angeles was well positioned with the recent success of the passage of HHH. Having that vehicle by which to produce affordable housing along with the facilities put the city in a good position to be able to leverage those resources. One of the charges that this committee gave Mr. Llewellyn and myself was to try to ensure that the City of Los Angeles was able to secure the maximum amount of money for the City of Los Angeles. And I will say that of the $258 million that will be coming in this first year, $201 million, or roughly 78%, will be going to LAHSA, either led or co-led programs that they administer. So I'd say that's a fairly good share of those resources, and there was a lot of fighting going back and forth, but I'd say that we did fairly well in those negotiations. And what was approved by the County Board of Supervisors yesterday was the next year's budget, as well as tentative budgets for the subsequent 2 years. Those matters will be reviewed in the future, but by and large, the overall process by which we were able to derive a budget was, I think, by and large, successful for the City of LA. And I'm going to turn this over to Meg Barclay, who really was behind the scenes working with Richard and myself, and can give you some more details of some of the specifics that are in the budget.
Thanks, Rich. I'm here on behalf of Rich. He's out of town today. So you also should have received a handout with these were the funding recommendations that were approved by the Board of Supervisors yesterday. So year 1, year 2, and year 3 recommended funding allocations across the 21 Measure H eligible strategies. So as Rich said, $201 million, or 78% of the $258 million that's budgeted in the first year is going to 7 core strategies, many of which are led or co-led by LAHSA. And many of them correspond to the activities or programs that LASA received one-time funding for in the FY 16-17 budget. Programs like rapid rehousing, outreach, strengthening the CES, and enhancing the emergency shelter system. E8 funding, which is the emergency shelter strategy, will largely support existing shelter capacity in the first year. There's also funding to add 1,000 additional shelter beds in the first year. Most of the county shelter beds right now that are currently operating are located in the city of LA. The funding recommendations that were approved by the Board of Supervisors also allocated significant funding to programs that are being run by the city of LA or associated departments as well. One of the most significant ones of those that will support Proposition HHH is the funding for Strategy D7, which is supportive services for permanent supportive housing. That basically guarantees that every unit that we're funding, permanent supportive housing unit that we're funding with Proposition HHH will have the services component, which, as you all know, is very important to making sure those units are successful. The other two strategies of note are B4, which is facilitating utilization of federal rental subsidies. That strategy will provide up to $3,500 for landlord incentives for up to 1,200 Section 8 vouchers if HACLA has those available and is setting those aside for homeless tenants. $3,500 of landlord incentives will be made available to facilitate leasing those units. And also strategies C2 and C7. These strategies changed significantly during the Measure H planning process. And by the end, the Strategy C7 was completely changed to be about implementing and the LA RISE program countywide. So we can expect the Economic and Workforce Development Department to get some of that Measure H funding to continue the work that they're doing now under our City Strategy 9A. One thing to note, one change that was made in the county board letter is, and as it relates to the budget decisions that were made just recently, about a month ago, funding recommendations for 9 emergency response teams to support LAPD HOPE teams were changed to designate these teams to support law enforcement countywide. LASA is working now on the plan to implement that, and we'll know more about what that might mean, what that change might mean as that moves forward at this point. But yeah, that concludes the presentation. Our presentation on Measure H. Peter is here to talk about what it means.
So I think that the programs that the city initiated using one-time funding last year were very successful in ensuring continuity and expansion across the city. And there were none of the programs that were initially implemented that were captured by county strategies that received a cut or a decrease in any way. Particularly important was the expansion of the rapid rehousing program. The county's initial use of rapid rehousing for the general single adult population was funded through the Department of Health Services, our colleagues and ally in this work. The expansion will leverage the city's investment in LASA's capacity for single adults and will expand that program countywide. So there is a general, essentially, funding of the entire effort that was funded by the city and then expansion of the capacity. So across the board, all of the initial investments that the city made are well leveraged in the measures that went forward. Of the shelter portfolio, Meg has indicated that there are about 1,100 new units that are going to be deployed for shelter crisis housing across the county. That does, some of the strategies are being essentially funded through the allocation based on need that the city is, well positioned to receive, because the count allocation is by service planning area, and about 80% of the population, of the people experiencing homelessness cover service planning areas that overlap with the city of LA. So the city of LA is about 60% of the total population of people experiencing homelessness in the county of Los Angeles, but the city's geographic footprint overlaps 5 service planning areas, which collectively are about 80% of the population. So, it will result in a good overlay of resource to need in the city of LA. The rapid rehousing program is going to be deployed that way, according to service planning area need. The shelter portfolio is not. It is it was generally deemed that the overriding concern, since there's essentially a deficit in shelter everywhere, the overriding concern was where we could site facilities. So there's essentially a sort of first mover advantage from a facilities perspective on siting shelter. And so we're working to identify where shelters can be located as rapidly as possible. And so the deployment of those is largely going to follow where the availability will be as opposed to specific geographic disbursement. The rest of the strategies are being deployed on a, at need basis, which will follow the 2017 homeless count. And we'll come back, I think we're scheduled to come back in a couple of weeks to present on that. LAHSA's actual, so the core strategies, as they indicated, was about 200 of the 256 million. The responsibility set from LAHSA's perspective of just LAHSA deployment is about 140 million. So if we consider the allocation of funding from the city, about 35 million down, it's up 140. So it's a considerable new investment that will be, put out through the infrastructure that we've built. And so we're working on our capacity to deliver that. We're working on new contracting methodologies that'll streamline that process, and working with all of our vendors to increase their capacity. And that's one of the issues that came up in the process was, thinking through the infrastructure and the need of our contractors and how to grow that base and the capacity of their organizations to actually deliver this service. So there's technical assistance funding built into these strategies. There's some additional admin, that they can actually have a better, capture of what their administrative costs are. And there's also just some upfront startup costs that are provided in these strategies as well. It's a pretty good match to what the city had initiated. I think on the question with regard to the HOPE teams, it is true that the county-wide deployment may impact the way that the LAHSA ERT are working with the HOPE teams now. We are in discussions with the county CEO's office about exactly how that will go. There are some additional ERT funded, and we're working through the implications of that. But it won't happen immediately, if there is some change in the way they're deployed. We'll be able to come back and report on the impact of that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Questions, Mr. Price?
Thank you for the presentation. It's good to see the numbers laid out as they are here, kind of broken down. Question about F7, the Housing Innovation Fund. What's that going to do exactly? How's that going to fit in?
That's a one-time fund. It's really meant to identify things. There's lots of different types of housing modalities and just different approaches aside from maybe how we've traditionally funded affordable and permanent, well,
so
actually in this case,
permanent
supportive housing.
Yeah,
so the county CEO is actually going to run that process to identify some new ideas on a really pilot basis that may, if they're successful, end up getting folded into how the other F7 money is implemented, but it's unknown really at this time what those kinds of projects will be.
I think it's important to note that there was a lot of debate over that particular item and the dollar amount. At one point, it was initially proposed, I think it was $10 million. Yeah. So there was a lot of debate over the utilization of said resources, and it was eventually ratcheted down. But it's important to note that's really county dollars, county housing department. We will try to coordinate with them as best as possible. We're not quite clear what they're going to be doing, but we'll keep close tabs on that.
Okay. And then, Mr. Chairman, you're familiar with the project, the pilot project that we're doing in CD9 with the parking? Is that the project in this budget, or is it someplace else?
I think it's someplace else, but they would know. It's a safe parking.
Safe parking program, is that in here, or is
city,
that?
But no, that's city general fund. There was no analogous strategy in the county set of strategies, so there wasn't a place to address that in the county Measure H planning process.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Mr. Price. Thank you all for your work on that committee. I know it was quite daunting, but I think both in Measure H and Measure HHH, it's very important that we get out the box early, so people can see some qualitative difference, things they can see, touch, and feel. as they've made an investment in tackling the homelessness problem. There was some back and forth between several members of this committee, and the council president and I even penned a letter to folks over up the hill at the Board of Supervisors around this issue of ERT teams and other issues, but we were really focused on that. Can you just talk about how that conversation went and where we landed?
So we haven't yet landed. So from a funding perspective, there was Strategy E6 is countywide coordinated outreach, and there were essentially three components of it. One component was the element that was currently funded through city general funds, which is funding the coordinated entry system lead agencies to do generalist outreach in their regions and coordinate very closely in pulling people off the street. Second component, which is essentially analogous to the C3 deployment in some of the areas and some multidisciplinary teams, is being funded through the health agency on the county, and that includes specialists in behavioral health and mental health, and those multidisciplinary teams are going to expand to a greater share. That was the largest, from a dollars perspective, the largest share. There'd be 25 of those multidisciplinary teams deployed. And the third element was LASA ERT. One component of that was to expand our coverage with C3 in various deployments. Another element was to essentially fund some of the county workers that are ERT that are currently deployed but not full-time. The last two pieces were to pick up the cost of the HOPE teams, adding one, and to add 8 more ERT that could be deployed across the entire county. So we had essentially in there the funding for 17 county-wide teams, 9 of which are designated as law enforcement liaison. So one of the elements that we're negotiating right now with the county is exactly how the expectations will work that those will be deployed. I think that there's a clear recognition that this is important to the city. I think there's a clear recognition that the HOPE teams are currently deployed and very effective working with LAPD, and that there is there's a large-scale investment in essentially assuring that there's continuity there. And we're articulating that very clearly. I think that message has been heard, and we're trying to ensure that there is a good county-wide coverage for liaison work with law enforcement. Obviously, we are still in a position where LASA ERT are greatly outnumbered by the number of law enforcement teams that there are out there that are working with people experiencing homelessness. But I think that the model of deployment that we have with the HOPE teams, I think our effort is to ensure that there's continuity with that approach, and we think we can get there. But we haven't landed, so I don't have where we landed exact specification for you.
I think also this is where that distinction between what the Board of Supervisors was asked to approve yesterday and what will continue to be discussed moving forward is important, because they approved the distribution of funds among the strategies, but the implementation, as it's described in the funding requests that's attached to that board letter, is still, that could still be, isn't set in stone. It wasn't something that was approved as written by the Board of Supervisors yesterday, so we can continue to watch that implementation process and advocate and try and see what happens.
Well, that's correct.
Mr. Price.
Yeah, one last question. I see here there are lots of, several entries in here for families. Anything for youth specifically?
Yes, sir.
Where is that?
So there's one specific strategy in E14, enhanced services for transition age youth, and obviously one of the challenges that we had is that we were asked to provide proposals that were by strategy. Some of these strategies overlap, obviously. So if you want rapid rehousing for youth, obviously you could stick it in the youth strategy or you could stick it in the rapid rehousing strategy. We took the approach that we would allocate population portions of each strategy in the strategy that's the core. So for example, rapid rehousing has a set of units that were aligned with the needs for youth, the needs for families, single adults, and things like that. So many of the strategy components for youth are actually embedded in those other strategies. It ended up being, we did look specifically at youth, and I have those data. it ended up being somewhere in the order of 18 million in year one funds, in part because there's startup and there's holdover for some of those funds, but it's about 40 million in year two funds. So it's a significant investment in both rapid rehousing, shelter, but also transitional housing for youth. That's one of the big components that was actually in that youth strategy. So there's a considerable investment in addressing youth homelessness. Obviously, the count numbers, which would indicate that we have a significant need there as well.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, anything else, Mr. Price?
No, thank
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for your report, and thank you for your work on that very dynamic committee for such an important part of our strategy. I think that this takes us to items 3 and 4, Mr. Clerk, which
Thank you, sir.
we'll take
Items
together.
3 and 4. Items 3 and 4 are Homeless Strategy Committee reports relative to the Comprehensive Homeless Strategy Quarterly Performance Report for the second and third quarter of fiscal year 2016-17.
Thank you, Ms. Barclay.
And Meg Barclay, City Homeless Coordinator in the CAO's office, again. So the Q2 Quarterly Performance Report represents the update for the period ending December 31st, 2016. And the Q3 Quarterly Performance Report, or QPR, is for the period ending, the 3 months ending March 31st, 2017. Both QPRs provide the status and next steps for the 62 active strategies in the Comprehensive Homeless Strategy and highlight key accomplishments during Q2 and Q3, respectively. The Q2 QPR in particular presents a proposed metrics framework for reporting outcomes for each individual strategy, and also a way of translating those strategy-specific outcomes into a broader report on the Comprehensive Homeless Strategy as a whole. So that is probably the most complicated of all the things that are in these two reports today. But if you have the second quarter QPR in front of you, that discussion starts on page 5. But there are 3 levels of metrics that we're proposing as we start to look at more specific outcomes of the strategies going forward. Strategy-specific metrics that would allow each of the strategy leads to provide data specific to the work that they're doing on these strategies, because as you know, there's a lot of them and they're very diverse. Just a lot of different work happening under all of those strategies. And then we have a broader set of 6 headline metrics that are proposed, and then an even broader set of strategy-wide metrics. So the relationship between the six headline metrics are get at number of people who are prevented from becoming homeless, number who gain employment or enroll in vocational training, the number placed in temporary housing, number placed in permanent housing, number who retain housing from the date of placement, and expanded supportive and affordable housing supply. So those are sort of the 6 broad measures that we would recommend measuring the strategy as a whole by. If you go to, on page 6, there's sort of a graphic that outlines the kind of relationship between these 2 levels, the strategy-specific and the headline metrics. But the idea is that every strategy would have at least one strategy-specific metric that corresponds to one of the headline metrics, so that as we're collecting the data across all of the strategies, we can kind of translate it into these 6 broader metrics. Attachment 2 to the QPR, it actually has each of the strategies, what are their proposed strategy level metrics, which of those metrics would kind of correspond to which headline metrics. So that's where there's fewer entries in that column. Also, how often they could report this data and when they expect to be able to actually start to provide the data. And getting back to that relationship between the strategy-specific metrics and the headline metrics, attachment 3 provides each of the 6 headline metrics and which of the individual strategies will report at least one metric that corresponds to that headline metric. And actually there's an updated attachment 3 that was handed out, and it also has bigger print, but it's this document here. There were some strategies that were missing from the document that's attached to the report you have today, and this is a comprehensive list. So if you approve the metrics framework today, we will actually collect the metrics for the first time for the fourth quarter quarterly performance report and be able to provide the first set of data on performance metrics for the comprehensive homeless strategy. So that is the most significant request today for the Q2 quarterly performance report as we continue the implementation of the comprehensive homeless strategy. The Q3 quarterly performance report provides an update on the status of Measure H, which you just also heard in, which is more up to date now, as you heard in item 2 on today's agenda, and an update on the implementation of Proposition HHH, which, as you know, last week your committee and the Housing Committee approved the funding allocations for the first bond issuance for Proposition HHH, and those bonds should be issued in the next month or so. Key accomplishments in Q2 and Q3, continued progress implementing the CES. That system is becoming more comprehensive and more implemented. A lot of the funding that the city put in 16-17 for implementing the CES went into full effect in the second and third quarters of this year. HACLA began to implement the landlord incentive program, which, as you heard, is now going to get a boost from Measure H funding. EWDD continued to implement the LA Rise program, and as of the end of Q3, 275 homeless individuals have been placed in subsidized housing. 47 of those have been moved on to unsubsidized employment. And as of the end of Q3, HCID has financed, this year, HCID has financed 356 affordable housing units, 108 of which are PSH, and 376 affordable housing units have been completed, and 135 of those are PSH. The third quarter quarterly performance report is a status update. There's nothing for you to approve at this time, so that item is recommended to be received and filed.
Excellent. So we have a recommendation to approve item number 3 and a recommendation to note and file item 4. Is there any discussion on this matter, gentlemen?
Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir.
Just for clarification, for item 3, you're approving the report and receiving the new revised attachment 3 that
Yes.
was just submitted in committee.
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Excellent. So it's been moved
Yes,
without
sir.
objection?
Yes, sir.
That'll be the order.
Yes, sir.
What is that?
That clears the desk, sir.
Excellent. The desk is clear. We are adjourned.